In the dying light of the 1970s, the jungles of Southeast Asia whispered with the ghosts of empires. Vietnam, a nation carved by war and reborn through ashes, stood once more on the edge of history's blade. To its west, the blood-soaked fields of Cambodia were ruled by the Khmer Rouge, a regime that devoured its own children in the name of purity. Between them stretched a border not of peace, but of nightmares. Villages burned in the darkness, rivers carried the dead, and the air thickened with the scent of decay and vengeance. The world, exhausted by the echoes of Vietnam's war against America, turned its gaze elsewhere. But Hanoi's leaders could not look away. Across the frontier, their people were slaughtered, their patience eroded. The decision to invade Cambodia in December 1978 would be painted as liberation, as solidarity, as justice. Yet behind the slogans and speeches hid deeper motives: survival, pride, revenge, and the unending hunger for control in a region where ideology had replaced mercy. This is not the story told in textbooks. This is the story of power and ghosts of nations that bled each other beneath a crimson sky. The year was 1978 and the rains had returned to the rice fields of southern Vietnam. In the Mekong Delta, farmers bent beneath grey skies, their hands slick with mud and memory. The war with America had ended barely 3 years earlier, yet its ghosts still haunted every flooded trench and every burned-out village. Children played among bomb craters that had become ponds. The land had not healed, it had only paused to breathe. But along the western border, that fragile breath began to choke again. From the forests of Cambodia came the sound of gunfire, not from foreign invaders, but from a neighbor once called brother. The Khmer Rouge, born from the chaos of the same wars that had nearly destroyed Vietnam, now ruled Cambodia with a cruelty that defied language. Their leader, Pol Pot, saw purity in blood and enemies in shadow. His men crossed the border in the night, machetes glinting under moonlight, raiding Vietnamese villages and slaughtering entire families. To Hanoi, it was not war yet, but it was coming. The borderlands became a land of whispers. Traders vanished, livestock were found mutilated. Survivors told stories of Khmer Rouge soldiers speaking of cleansing, of revenge for centuries of humiliation under Vietnamese rule. The echoes of old history, when the Nguyen lords had conquered parts of Cambodia, were resurrected by the new ideologues in Phnom Penh. For the Khmer Rouge, every Vietnamese face was an ancient oppressor. For Vietnam, every Cambodian incursion was a test of patience. In Hanoi, within the worn stone walls of the government compound, the men who had defeated the United States gathered again around maps soaked in sweat and tension. They had dreamed of rebuilding, of schools, of unity. Instead, they faced hunger, internal dissent, and a border bleeding with atrocities. Le Duan, the aging General Secretary of the Communist Party, understood that peace had never truly arrived. He saw Pol Pot not as a fellow revolutionary, but as a madman drunk on ideology. Yet the world watched in silence. China had embraced the Khmer Rouge as a counterweight against Soviet influence in Vietnam. The Cold War's invisible lines carved Southeast Asia like scars. The Vietnamese soldiers stationed near An Giang and Tay Ninh began writing letters home that spoke of horror. They found bodies nailed to trees, women dragged into the jungle, and babies thrown into the river. Each attack came with the same message, carved into walls or whispered by the few who survived. The border is ours. It was not just bloodshed, it was a declaration. Hanoi could no longer ignore the screams at its doorstep. But the decision to invade was not born solely of vengeance. Vietnam, newly unified, faced starvation and international isolation. Aid from the Soviet Union came at a price, alignment with Moscow's agenda. Meanwhile, China, once an ally, had turned cold and distant, accusing Vietnam of betrayal. To the north, Beijing's influence was tightening around Cambodia, transforming it into a weapon aimed at Hanoi's flank. Vietnam stood encircled by hostility. In the villages, the people sensed the shift long before the politicians announced it. Conscription notices returned. Trains began carrying soldiers south, their rifles wrapped in cloth to hide the gleam of steel. The veterans who had fought in Hue and Khe Sanh were called back into service, muttering that the ghosts of the last war had risen again. Mothers prepared meals heavy with rice and salt, the taste of farewell on their tongues. The sound of boots and trucks replaced the songs of harvest. In Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge prepared their own reckoning. Pol Pot believed Vietnam's unity after the American War was a threat to his revolution. He saw in Vietnam's strength a mirror of what Cambodia had lost centuries ago. His purges within Cambodia grew even more violent, turning against anyone accused of Vietnamese influence. Even children who spoke a few Vietnamese words were executed. The regime declared that the border must be purified through fire. By mid-1978, entire Vietnamese communes were wiped from the map. Reports of massacres reached Hanoi almost weekly. One attack near Ba Choc left over 3,000 civilians dead, men, women, monks, and infants. The Vietnamese leadership realized that no amount of diplomacy would stop the killing, but they also saw an opportunity. By striking Cambodia, they could remove a hostile regime, assert dominance in Indochina, and secure Soviet support in the global struggle against China. As the monsoon faded, Vietnam's patience did too. Quietly, divisions from the People's Army began to mass near the border. Their uniforms were patched and worn, their weapons a mix of Soviet rifles and American relics captured years before. They moved through the jungle like ghosts, avoiding villages, building makeshift bridges over rivers swollen with the season's last rains. To the villagers watching from their huts, it was as if the mountains themselves were shifting. They knew what was coming. War had a certain smell: oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of anticipation. When the order came in late December 1978, it carried no fanfare. Hanoi called it a defensive counterattack. The soldiers called it vengeance. At dawn, the border erupted. Artillery thundered from the Vietnamese side, flattening outposts held by the Khmer Rouge. Columns of tanks rolled through muddy roads, cutting paths through forest and flame. Birds scattered, and the air filled with the sound of iron and thunder. For the first time since the American withdrawal, Vietnam was at war again, but this war was not one of ideology alone. It was survival, of borders, of pride, of memory. Every soldier who crossed the border carried not only a rifle, but the burden of history. They fought not just to end Pol Pot's terror, but to ensure that the land their fathers died for would not burn again. As villages on both sides turned to smoke, the old wounds of empire reopened. The Mekong ran red once more, carrying with it the silence of those who would never return. When the first columns of Vietnamese soldiers entered Cambodian soil in the final days of December 1978, the sky hung low with smoke and silence. The jungles that once concealed American bombers now echoed with the sound of advancing armor. For the villagers who watched from a distance, it was as if the ghosts of the old wars had returned wearing new flags. Soldiers moved through the mist, boots sinking into the soaked earth, faces hardened by memories of another decade spent in endless combat. To many, the difference between peace and war had become meaningless. The Vietnamese offensive was fast, precise, and unrelenting. Years of jungle warfare had made their army resilient, their soldiers unafraid of mud or rain. They struck across multiple fronts, crushing Khmer Rouge divisions that had grown soft from years of ruling through fear rather than discipline. In Phnom Penh, Pol Pot's inner circle refused to believe the invasion would reach them. They told their soldiers that Vietnam's army was too exhausted, that their own revolutionary spirit would repel any attack. But ideology cannot stop artillery. Within weeks, Vietnamese tanks were rolling through shattered Cambodian towns. The roads were littered with the remnants of the Khmer Rouge's fanaticism. Overturned ox carts, abandoned rifles, bodies of children still clutching the red scarves of the regime. Those who had survived the purges of Tuol Sleng prison whispered that judgment had come at last. Yet judgment in war is never pure. As Vietnam advanced, Cambodia's land became a graveyard for both victim and liberator alike. The ordinary people, caught between collapsing tyranny and invading saviors, did not cheer at first. Many had been conditioned to see the Vietnamese as ancient enemies. Centuries of Cambodian folklore painted Vietnam as the serpent that devoured their kingdoms. Even as the Khmer Rouge's grip loosened, that old fear lingered like a curse. When Vietnamese troops distributed rice and medicine, villagers stared at them with hollow eyes, uncertain if the help was real or another trick of power. In Hanoi, victory was already being crafted into ideology. The invasion was officially declared a campaign of solidarity, a mission to rescue the Cambodian people from genocide. There was truth in that claim, but it was not the whole truth. Behind the speeches and banners lay a quiet understanding among Vietnam's leaders. If Cambodia remained under Pol Pot, Vietnam's own revolution would be strangled from the West. The Khmer Rouge had become an instrument of Beijing, and China's influence was creeping closer every month. By toppling Pol Pot, Hanoi not only avenged the massacres of its people, but also positioned itself as the new, dominant power in Indochina. The Soviet Union, hungry for a foothold in Southeast Asia after America's retreat, supported Vietnam with supplies, weapons, and diplomatic cover. In return, Vietnam became Moscow's bastion in the tropical world, a communist partner surrounded by capitalist and Chinese threats. The invasion, then, was not merely a response to border raids. It was a declaration of alignment in the shifting tectonics of the Cold War. Every tank that rolled into Cambodia carried not just a flag, but the weight of global rivalry. As January 1979 dawned, the fall of Phnom Penh was inevitable. The Khmer Rouge, realizing their myth of invincibility had shattered, fled into the jungles. Pol Pot, the man who dreamed of turning Cambodia into an agrarian utopia of death, disappeared into the northwest with his closest followers. When Vietnamese troops entered the capital, they found a city stripped of humanity. Streets were empty except for bones. Schools had been turned into prisons, hospitals into morgues. The air smelled of dust and death. Among the ruins, Vietnamese soldiers walked in silence. They had seen horror before, but this was something else. The genocide revealed itself slowly in the piles of skulls, in the echoes of cries that still seemed to haunt the hallways of Tuol Sleng. Many soldiers vomited when they saw what had been done to the prisoners, the torture rooms, the blood-stained floors. For some, it no longer felt like a campaign of conquest, but a mission to bury the dead. Yet, even in that moment of grim triumph, Vietnam's motives remained tangled. The leadership installed a new government in Phnom Penh, composed of Khmer Rouge defectors who had fled Pol Pot's purges. They called it the People's Republic of Kampuchea, a regime friendly to Hanoi, loyal to its vision of socialist unity. Cambodia, once independent, had become a satellite orbiting its neighbor. Hanoi justified this as stability. The world saw it as occupation. China reacted with fury. To Beijing, Vietnam's invasion was not liberation but betrayal, a Soviet proxy striking down a Chinese ally. The ancient triangle of rivalry between Vietnam, China, and Cambodia had reignited under a new ideological mask. Pol Pot had sought Chinese favor by embracing Maoist extremism. Vietnam now paid for it in blood and politics. In February 1979, China struck back. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across Vietnam's northern border, announcing a punitive expedition. The message was clear: Vietnam's reach had grown too bold. For 3 brutal weeks, the Vietnamese countryside burned once more. From Lang Son to Lao Cai, villages were leveled, civilians killed, and entire communities displaced. The same soldiers who had just returned from Cambodia now fought to defend their own homeland. But Hanoi did not withdraw from Cambodia. Even as Chinese artillery thundered in the north, Vietnamese forces held their ground in the west. They believed that if they retreated, Cambodia would again become a dagger pointed at their heart. The price of control was heavy. For the next decade, Vietnam remained entangled in Cambodia's shattered landscape, fighting guerrillas loyal to Pol Pot, managing famine, and facing international isolation. The world condemned the invasion. Western nations, still wary of communism, accused Vietnam of imperialism. China cut off aid and pushed for sanctions. Even some of Vietnam's allies urged restraint. But in the villages along the Mekong, the story was told differently. Refugees who had survived the Khmer Rouge spoke of gratitude mixed with sorrow. They said the Vietnamese brought an end to the killing, even if peace arrived in the shadow of occupation. Years passed. The jungles swallowed the remnants of Pol Pot's army, but the wounds between the two nations festered. The border villages that had once traded in rice and fish now traded in silence. Vietnamese soldiers stationed deep within Cambodia began to marry locals, build schools and plant gardens beside their barracks. Some children grew up speaking both languages, not knowing whether to call the men in uniform liberators or conquerors. History, as always, refused to give a simple answer. By the late 1980s, the war had drained Vietnam's spirit. The Soviet Union was weakening, its promises fading. International pressure mounted for withdrawal. Hanoi, exhausted and isolated, finally agreed. In 1989, after a decade of occupation, the last Vietnamese troops left Cambodia. They did not march home as victors nor as defeated men. They returned carrying stories of friendship and hatred, of hunger and hope, of brothers turned to ashes by the fire of history. Pol Pot lived on, hidden in the jungle, his movement shattered but not dead. Cambodia would spend another decade haunted by his shadow. Vietnam, too, would carry scars invisible to the eye. The cost of survival in a world where ideology demanded sacrifice. In the end, the invasion's true motives remained layered like sediment at the bottom of the Mekong. It was vengeance for murdered villages, but also strategy against China. It was solidarity with the Cambodian people, but also the assertion of dominance in Indochina. It was survival, dressed in the language of revolution. To the families who buried their dead on both sides, the speeches and ideologies meant little. They remembered the smell of smoke, the trembling of the ground when tanks passed, the moment the world seemed to hold its breath between one empire's fall and another's rise. Decades later, the scars of 1978 still shape the region. Cambodia's gratitude is cautious, Vietnam's pride subdued. Monuments stand where battles once raged, and tourists walk through Tuol Sleng with cameras, unaware that the dust beneath their feet carries the weight of two nations' pain. History does not offer redemption, only reflection. The invasion was neither purely righteous nor purely cruel. It was both, and more, a collision of necessity and ambition, vengeance and fear, compassion and control. In the shadows of that December war, one truth endures: nations, like people, are capable of mercy only when their survival is no longer at stake. And so the Mekong flows on, quiet and endless, washing over the bones of those who died for reasons that even their leaders could not fully name. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history.